Greetings, business management students. I'm going to go through this chapter with you, the strategic management process. This chapter is chapter 15 in the 8th edition of the textbook. The authors are Dutoit, Erasmus, and Stridom. The book is still available in our library, so you will be able to access it. I know most of you have now purchased the 10th edition and the 11th edition. So we will not request you to buy another copy of the textbook, which is the 8th edition. I'm sure we will be able to photocopy a chapter of this textbook, because we will only be photocopying one chapter so that we can make it available for you. I understand we covered Introduction to General Management, where we may also have looked at other aspects of strategic management in chapter 6. But the main reason why we have to go back to this particular chapter, the strategic management process, which you will only find in the 8th edition of the textbook, is that this chapter actually introduces you to two key concepts of management. One being the strategic management process, which we didn't look at in chapter 6, and also management intelligence systems. So basically this chapter will be focusing on those two key concepts: the strategic management process and also management intelligence systems. Maybe before we move on, it is also important to know what we mean by the strategic management process. Basically, this is a comprehensive management approach that encompasses and directs management activities at all levels of management in the organization. This we also covered when we looked at chapter 6, where we said there is need for general management, or there is need for strategic management. Those people who have a holistic view of the organization, not looking at it in parts, not seeing other parts as more important than others, but having that holistic view of the organization, and having that understanding that if one function is not working well, if one function is not functioning properly, it may have an effect on the organization. Or if one level of management is not functioning as it ought to do, it will also have negative effects on the organization. So there is need for that holistic view of an organization. Strategic management, and basically management in general, they rely on information. And they rely on information and intelligence that is sourced by management intelligence systems. And management intelligence systems play a critical role in any organization, because they help to provide information that is very important for decision making. This is the chapter content, what we are supposed to cover, or what we will cover in this chapter. Basically, we'll look at the introduction, which I have sort of provided, but we will look at the introduction, then we'll look at strategic management, then strategic management process, then management intelligence systems, and we will conclude. So it's a short chapter, but we ought to understand it. Okay, looking at the introduction, strategic management considers organizations' environment to identify opportunities and threats, as well as internal strengths and weaknesses. Maybe before we even go there, it is important for me to state that the overall The overall purpose of strategic management is to ensure consistency in the management of an organization. There is what we call external consistency. We also have internal consistency and also dynamic consistency. So in the first instance, the selected strategies have to be consistent with the opportunities and threats that are presented by the external environment. Thus, external consistency. Then also the selected strategies have to be consistent with the core and distinctive capabilities that are basically with core strengths and weaknesses of the organization, and that speaks to internal consistency. As these may change over time and may accordingly prompt changes in strategy and sources of competitive advantage, it can also be seen as dynamic consistency, because these also change the availability and accessibility of resources by an organization, also the strengths and weaknesses of that particular organization. So it is important to highlight the overall purpose of strategic management, that it is to ensure consistency in the management of an organization. Strategic management considers organization's environment. Remember, we spoke of internal consistency and external consistency. So strategic management considers organization's environment to identify opportunities and threats, as well as internal strengths and weaknesses. So if we go back to your chapter 4, I'm sure you still remember that we said in the external environment, that's where you find, or that's where you look for opportunities and threats. But in the internal environment, you look for strengths and weaknesses. So in strategic management, we consider that business environment. You ought to have that understanding of the business environment to know that what happens in the external environment affects the organization. In as much as the organization may not have control over what happens in that particular environment, the organization can still be affected. The same with what transpires within the organization. Our capabilities, our strengths, our weaknesses, our ability to access resources, all those factors, they also affect the organization. So when it comes to strategic management, you ought to consider that your organization's environment, so that you will be able to know or to identify your own opportunities and threats, as well as your strengths and weaknesses. Strategic management also provides direction and intent to organization. It also identifies ways of creating value for stakeholders, because if you are able to understand your environment, you will be able to also identify opportunities. And it is through identifying opportunities that you can be able to maximize shareholders' interests or stakeholders' interests. It also provides a system for coordinating management activities of management in terms of their functions, different functions of the organization, in terms of the levels of management, also in terms of their day-to-day activities, planning, organizing, leading, controlling. It also helps to understand external environments and also the internal environments, which is key to organizations' planning. Because without an understanding of the environment, be it external or internal, it will become difficult for you to plan. And without you being able to plan as an organization, you will not be able to deal with change, which in chapter 4 we also said this is the only constant reality. The only constant thing is that there will be change. there will be change. Strategic management also optimizes consistency between different levels of management. We spoke of external consistency, internal consistency, and also dynamic consistency. So there is no need for me to further explain on that. It also optimizes consistency between organization and internal and external environments that I have alluded to. It also leads to sustained performance higher than the industry norm. So basically we are saying, if you have good strategic managers, or if your strategic management in an organization is good, it will lead to better performance which is higher than the industry norm. You will perform far much better than any other organization or than any other average organization, because strategic management will then have given you that competitive advantage over those other parties or those other organizations operating in your own industry or in the same industry where you will be operating. So this is basically the strategic management process, where we look first at strategic direction. We will explain that. Then there is also strategic objectives. Then there is need for external environmental analysis. Then you conduct also an internal environmental analysis. You choose the strategy, implement the strategy that we have been selected, and you control. There is also need for strategic control. So this figure, which you will also find in your textbook, it actually depicts the strategic management process, which still starts with the strategic direction, where you have your strategic objectives. Remember, you have to conduct external environmental analysis and internal environmental analysis so that you will be able to then select the strategies that work. After those strategies have been selected, remember, you ought to implement them, and there is always need for feedback to see if things are working or if things are not working. Then you also control. In terms of strategic control, just checking on whether what you actually intended to achieve is what is on the ground. So if there are any deviations, you control for those. See what it may have caused them and how can you move on. How can you resolve the challenges? So we move on to strategic direction and strategic objectives. It's important for you to realize that the strategic direction of an organization mostly consists of the vision and mission statement. The vision is quite, it can be seen as a dream, what you want to achieve, or the dream of the founder. The mission statement or the mission speaks to what an organization aspires to be. Why do they exist? Why do they exist? Who do they serve? So they should serve as inspiration to stakeholders. And both the vision and the mission, they ought to be short to remember, short enough to remember. Normally I ask students to give us or to state in class what is the vision of the University of Fort Hare. You will realize that most students will actually be at the university for some time, but until now they may not know the vision of the University of Fort Hare. If you ask students the mission of the University of Fort Hare, you will realize that very few of them actually know the mission of the University of Fort Hare. It's important for you to know the vision and the mission of any organization that you may find yourself in, so that you will also live to those values and to achieve that particular vision and that particular mission. It should be closely identified with the organization. That is the strategic direction and objectives. Strategic objectives, these are basically long-term objectives. Maybe what is it that you want to achieve in 5 years? It also contains an indication of the future direction of the organization. What is it that the organization aspire to be? What is it that the organization wish to achieve in future? So we're basically looking at the vision, mission, and long-term objectives. Then external environmental analysis. The main purpose of conducting external environmental analysis is to identify opportunities and threats. And we said external environmental analysis, this happens when you are trying to analyze what is happening in that particular environment where you do not have control over as an organization. Opportunities allow the organization to meet or exceed strategic objectives. But now in terms of threats, they can constrain the ability of the organization to meet objectives. So threats may actually threaten the existence of an organization. In chapter 4, I remember you defined opportunities as a favorable condition in the external environment, that when it's exploited correctly, it may lead to advantages to an organization. However, threats were defined as unfavorable conditions in the external environment that may threaten the continued existence of the organization if they are not properly managed. Then there's also need to conduct internal environmental analysis. Basically, this one you conduct it to discover what an organization is better at compared to its competitors. So you look from within the organization, what is it that you can do better than your competitors? So it helps you to also uncover key weaknesses that could prevent the organization from attaining objectives or make it vulnerable to its competition. So you are not only looking at what you are good at as an organization, but also at your weak points that may give advantage to your competitors. There is also need to understand the role of resources and core capabilities in an organization. So that is also part of internal environmental analysis, where you also analyze to what extent does an organization have access to certain resources and to certain skills that may be important for that organization to succeed or to perform better than other organizations. Basically, organizations can actually become better and successful if they exploit their assets or their resources or their capabilities well. So there is need for you to understand what is it that you are good at, what is it that may be your weaknesses as an organization, what are your capabilities, what resources do you have, and how best can you use those resources and your own strengths so that you will benefit from those at the expense of your competitors. So, speaking about competitors, there is need for organizations to perform better than their competitors if they are to survive in this competitive and dynamic world that we are living in. So there are three choices that organizations can choose from if they want to gain competitive advantage. One is that of differentiation, so they can use differentiation strategies where competitive advantage stems from higher prices that customers are willing to pay for perceived quality of the product. So if you differentiate your products make them look different from those of all other competitors and make customers perceive them or believe that your products are of higher quality, the end result is that your customers will end up willing to pay a premium for your products from the time that they believe or that they perceive your products to be of high quality. So if you manage to differentiate your product, you may actually gain competitive advantage. There is also what is known as cost leadership strategies, where competitive advantage stems from the ability to produce products and services at lower production costs than competitors. So when we looked at differentiation strategy, that is more to do with marketing management, where you differentiate your products from those of your competitors so that others may be willing to pay more for your products. But when we look at cost leadership strategies, these apply more, or they are more relevant when we look at them from an operations perspective or from a purchasing and supply perspective. Because in this case, competitive advantage stems from the ability to produce products and services at lower production costs than competitors. So we are saying if you are using materials, if you are using machines that can produce those products better and quicker at a cost-effective way than your competitors, you will be able to sell those products at a lower price. So that will give you cost leadership advantage. Another way also to be able to sell products at a lower price without incurring losses is when you manage to source your raw materials at a lower price. So if you manage to source raw materials at a lower price, you will be able to produce products at a lower cost, and still you will be able to sell those at a lower price, making a profit or without making a loss. So it is for that reason that I say cost leadership strategies, they are more linked to operations management and also purchasing and supply management. Then there is also focus strategies. With focus strategies, an organization will attempt to gain dominance in a narrow segment in the market through either differentiation or cost leadership. So they will not focus on all products. They will just look for a market niche, then they focus on that particular market niche. They will then either differentiate their products or follow a cost leadership strategy. Okay, we move on to strategy implementation, which is basically the doing part of the strategy. In this case, the organizing and leading take place to ensure that strategies are implemented effectively and efficiently. So effectiveness, we're basically looking at those strategies that we have formulated, they ought to be implemented. But we are not looking at whether they've wasted time, whether they've wasted resources. But when we speak of efficiency, we're now looking at the time that was taken. We're also looking at whether that was the best possible way that was supposed to be done. So you realize that leadership and culture, they also come into play in terms of implementation of strategy. implementation of strategy. And in terms of these, you ought to understand the role of routines, rituals, stories, symbols, power structures, control systems, organization structure, and also paradigm. Routines, they basically describe the way people in organizations do things around there. How do they do things? So basically, these are behaviors that members of the organization display towards people inside as well as outside the organization. They can be positive or even negative in nature, and the ideal is to reinforce positive behavior that supports the strategic direction. Then when it comes to rituals, these are activities or events through which an organization reinforces its values and the way that it does things. They can be formal or even informal. It's also important to realize that organizational culture is also reinforced by stories that are told both inside the organization and outside the organization. Then when we speak of symbols, we're speaking of symbols such as logos, buildings, vehicles, and any other physical manifestations that people can associate with. We can also even think of aspects such as shorthand language. They also form part of symbols. Then there is also power structures in an organization, control systems, the organizational structure. All those may have an effect on strategy implementation. And also an organization's paradigm, which is the overall picture of how employees think about their organization. The overall picture of how people within an organization think of their organization. It's also obviously affected by competencies of people within the organization, including managers, technology and ability to use it, and also processes that have to be followed in an organization. So there's need to be both forward-looking as well as backward-looking when we formulate strategy and when we implement strategy. You must also have both internal focus as well as external focus. You must not only consider factors from within the organization, but you must also consider those from outside the organization, because they both have an effect on the performance of your organization. You must also be able to manage by exception. You don't have to be rigid, but you ought to be able to manage by exception. You ought to be systematic and also to be actionable. Not to be a person who only plans, or not to have managers in an organization who only plan but never put things into action. Then the aspects of strategic control that we should look at, it's competitive intelligence. Competitive intelligence basically refers to those environmental scanning activities that the organization undertakes constantly to monitor its external environment. This process can also help the organization to answer questions such as, are the assumptions, are the assumptions that we made when formulating our strategy still valid, or there have been other changes? Are there opportunities or threats in our future that we may need to be aware of? So there we have human intelligence and also customers. And in terms of human intelligence is obtained from human contacts inside or outside the organization. Human contacts both inside and outside the organization. Then customers, although they are human sources of intelligence, they are special class of source because they can actually tell us whether they are satisfied or not, whether our products are meeting their needs or not, they are meeting their wants or not. So that's why we classify them on their own. Then we also have business intelligence systems, which is also known as BIS. These integrate various information systems with a view of making the information available to decision makers in the organization. So we have online analytical processing, which provides a means for users to view data from a data warehouse in a multidimensional format. There's also data mining, executive information systems, and issues to do with strategy alignment. So this, you can actually read it on your own, and we will still be able to discuss them or these aspects on our Blackboard discussion forums, where we'll be able to discuss and also give examples of those. So I urge you, when you go through this chapter, to also ask questions on Blackboard on discussion forums, so that we will be able to engage and discuss these further. We also have integrating mechanisms, and the main purpose or the main role of integrating mechanisms is to ensure that all available data is integrated, analyzed, and presented to management decision makers in such a way that it supports decision-making process. Not to confuse them, but so that it supports decision-making process. Chief information officers and analysts, their role needs to be understood. You can read that. Then processes like scenario analysis and planning, how do those play a role as part of integrating mechanisms? Then also the role of technology. Because some of these are actually now being done using technology, like using simulations, even using technology in data analysis. Those aspects, you also need to be able to read them on your own and participate in discussion forums, so that we can be able to debate these issues and understand them. So that was it about this chapter. We covered the strategic management process, and we also understood that strategic management provides overarching process of management decisions and actions. There are many systems that exist to help organizations, and it is important to understand the role of information in strategic management as means to monitor, evaluate, and control. Information belongs to organization, and it should be entrenched in strategy. Don't formulate strategy without information. Do not implement strategy without information. Thank you so much. I hope to engage with you all in our discussion forums on Blackboard, so that we can engage there, ask questions, contribute to what other people ask, so that we can engage and analyze and understand this particular chapter. Thank you so much.